so that they actually look down on their culture. They become extra-environmentals, is a way of putting this. They act the role of the extraterrestrial, and we all can act the role of the extraterrestrial when we adopt this extra-environmental position. It can be viewed as alienation if what arises out of it is a feeling of forlornness and being cast into being, as Heidegger says. But that need not necessarily be the feeling. The extra-environmental is also tremendously freed from the cultural conditioning. And when you travel, you are always an extra-environmental, and you have a very deep insight into societies that you may only spend a short time in. I think the emerging archetype of the other or the alien is an effort to integrate alienation and actually make it a positive thing. And I think I mentioned either here or on Will's show about E.T. and how clever this was to make people identify with something which looks like a cross between a can of anchovies and the Pillsbury Doughboy. And to actually, love is what that movie is about, and it's alien love. And it's a very important form of love to cultivate, because this process of integration of the electronic overself that is one way of looking at the end of history, that is the process that we're all involved in. And psychedelics, which I haven't mentioned too much tonight, but which I hope you realize are the entire source and motivation and raison d'etre of all of this. Because what psychedelics are doing they are anticipating this future state, this electronic global information organism is in fact already present in the same way that most of the future is present in the past. I mean, think of any point in the past. Think of 1950. Think how much of today was present in 1950. It means that this idea that science fiction has sold us that the future is a total other world just up around the bend, it isn't actually true. The future is 95% present in the present. And it is that 5% that eludes us that will provide the great adventure for the next 20, 30, 40 years as we come to terms with the fact that we are moving off into the human imagination. That's what this godlike thing is. It is not a filled space, a loving figure, an angel, a god, or a demon. It is an empty space, a space which we will fill with our dreams, essentially, because our dreams have always been the appetition leading us forward into history, but we have not understood why, especially over the last 500 years when it's become very unfashionable to believe in dreams and visions and revelations. But I think actually the faith is well-founded. It's well-founded because of the nature of the physics of time. And that is a physics that your own experience will reinforce for you if you examine it carefully enough. Thank you once again very much. I think we're going to have a brief break and then questions. Thank you. There's no question but what the human imagination has now taken to itself so much power that it can no longer remain on the surface of the planet. We sort of have to part company with the planet for our own good and for its. And it's just a commonplace of evolutionary theory that every frontier presents a genetic barrier because only the hale, the hardy, the adventurous, the healthy go. Certainly space is going to be the tightest genetic filter of that sort that has ever been laid on a human population. It's said, that the dynamics of North American society are due to the fact that we can all trace ourselves back to misfits and malcontents and religious screwballs and all these people who were out of it relative to Europe came here. A very similar thing will obviously happen in space. But your question is interesting. I can't quote him exactly, but when I spoke in Santa Cruz, Tim Poston, who's a mathematician, after it was all over, he quoted a modern poet saying, "It won't end with a statue of Jane Mansfield 50 miles high. It won't end," and he lists several things. "It will just go on. It will continue and continue and continue." And perhaps that's what human society will always be about. Perhaps there will always be a tacky element, and we will always flop on the seamy side. But I'm not sure. The things which we take to be so basic to humanness, such as all that I just mentioned, have all arisen since this hypothetical moment in Julian Jaynes' theory when we integrated the ego. Perhaps integrating the superego will actually make us stand taller and see more clearly into each other's needs. I think that the old evolutionary model, which was that evolution was the struggle of the fittest and the devil take the hindmost, is pretty much discredited, and we now understand that what is maximized in evolution is not the sharpness of the fang or the length of the claw, but the ability to cooperate with other species harmoniously. That's what's being maximized. Every parasite, every disease wants to be simply a benign parasite. No disease wants to see its host die, because then the party is over for everyone. So I would say, in answer to your question, I'm hopeful, but I certainly, humans are a perverse lot, and I suppose reasonably what one can hope for is incremental advancement toward the good. I studied political philosophy under Joe Tussman, and one of his favorite remarks he used to say to us was, when you look around at the world, it's a terrible show to be run by angels. But if you think of it as run by monkeys, pretty amazing. Another question. Any other question? Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to know if you've had any experience with ketamine, what you think of its place in the future and whatever.
Interesting question. What about ketamine? What do I think about it? Well, different things. First of all, you all know what ketamine is, or shall I briefly sketch it? Okay, this is a psychedelic drug that's recently come on the scene that is what's called a dissociative anesthetic. It was used as a veterinary and children's anesthetic from the early 60s onward, and it was only slowly was it realized that at low doses there were peculiar psychic phenomena, and when done as an anesthetic, it's done 600 ml IV push. That means straight into the vein under pressure as fast as you can, 600 milliliters, which would be just like being hit by a truck. But when it's done I don't like to say recreationally, so when it's done for its psychic effect, it's done like 100 milliliters IM into the muscle. And it's a troubling psychedelic because a lot of people, I think, are doing it who have never done any other. And I think that would be very, very misleading. When I did it, my first reaction was complete amazement that here was a category of experience that I had no idea existed. In other words, it was a slot on the bookshelf that I didn't realize was there. It is not like mescaline, not like LSD, not like psilocybin, not like DMT, not like ayahuasca, not like any of these things, and yet you cannot get away from the fact that it's a powerful psychedelic. So it's useful for that alone, to further expand the definition of what is a psychedelic drug. The problem that I have two problems with it, and both of them may be curmudgeonly on my part, so you don't have to take it from me. The first one is that it's very easy. The first thing that happens after you've done ketamine is you cease to be concerned that you've done ketamine. Before there is any other effect, that effect takes hold. And that's a funny thing. I'm on these tryptamine hallucinogens, you are fully aware that you've taken a drug, that you're walking on eggshells, that you should keep yourself alert to what's going on, and in other words, it puts you on your toes. You know you're in a dimension of risk and opportunity, and you comport yourself that way. On ketamine, your definitions dissolve so completely that it's a major accomplishment to realize that you're a human being on a drug. You keep discovering and losing that realization. You keep saying, oh yes, that's what it is. I'm somebody and I'm stoned somewhere. And that's what this is. Now it's coming back to me. Which brings me to the second thing about ketamine, which is puzzling. And this is a problem with all psychedelic drugs, but you have to sort of get a life strategy for dealing with it because it's important to overcome. And that is, it's very state-bounded, which is a term that the psychologist Roland Fisher coined, which means you can't remember anything about it. It's like an intense dream where you're intensely dreaming and the alarm goes off, and as you stumble to the shower, it's just, and there's nothing there. And ketamine is very much like this. While you're on it, there is a complete conviction that this is of staggering import to you and mankind. And then it is just totally mercurial and elusive and slips away. Now that in itself is obviously an interesting experience. And so ketamine seems to teach obliquely. It teaches you that there are psychedelic states that you might not have called psychedelic. It teaches you that there are wonderful insights that totally elevate you, that you can't remember 15 seconds later. So it sort of teaches you the richness of mind, but by example, rather than by the imparting of information that you can take away. And then whenever this question is asked, unlike my acquaintance John Lilly, I always feel like I have to say to people, if you're going to take a new drug, you should go to the medical literature and read it. And I know there's this much in reprints on ketamine because I have it. And what it will tell you is that there's a kindling effect, which means each time you do it, it is easier the next time to get loaded. However, on the neurophysiological level, or the level of an electroencephalogram, this kindling effect can be, I don't want to say it's dangerous, I just want to say it's a warning sign, because the same kind of kindling will precede petit mal seizure and other forms of seizure. Let me say, though, on this matter of drugs and how you judge them, especially now, since there are so many drugs in the MDA series making their way into society, MDA, MMDA, MDMA, MMDA2, a whole gamut of these, and there will be more down through the years. I've always taken the position that it was important that the psychedelic have a relationship to a plant, and that's almost a perfect fit for me because I approve of psilocybin and it comes from a plant, and mescaline and it comes from a plant, and LSD is sort of problematic because the LSD-25 that is what most people are familiar with is not from a plant. That's a creature of the laboratory. But analogs active in the milligram range, diethyl lysergic acid amide, occur in morning glories of several species and in ergot, and in some cases non-toxically. So as I live into the 80s, it's becoming harder and harder to maintain this thing about the importance of the plant because so many people can't imagine what you're talking about. They are totally devoted to one or another completely synthetic drug and are having revelations and loving insights and all these things. And so I feel a little bit like a Puritan, but until I know more about it, for myself, that's sort of the categories I'll work with. Also, the plant drugs almost always have a shamanic tradition associated with them that's several thousand years old. So they're use-tested in human societies, both for psychic effects and physiological effects. If a drug has been taken for 10,000 years, chances are it's fairly benign. Any other questions? Yes.
I was wondering if you read in the introduction of Psilocybin by Boston America a statement that the author purports to be from the mushroom, whereby the mushroom offers possible symbiote for the humans, offers to give them information on how to build spaceships, and what you think about that, and what you think of the symbiosis between humans and mushrooms, other than just taking mushrooms. Have you ever reflected on that? Have you read this introduction?
Yeah, I've read that introduction, yes. You're a brave man to ask the question. Oh no, I shouldn't kid you. I wrote the introduction. Because I am Otios and my brother is Oaniric. I can tell you this now because this book is going out of print. Well, when we wrote that was straight transcription. That's what the mushroom said. I don't know exactly what to make of this. These things stretch our categories because because it deals with our own definition of humanness. It's curious that the psilocybin mushroom that my book is about, or that our book is about, occurs in the dung of domesticated cattle, the Indian humpback cattle, Bos indicus, so that it has been since very early in human history, in a sense, a symbiote of man, because a symbiote of a domesticated animal, which man had a symbiotic relationship with. And when you study symbiosis among lower animals, you often find this situation where it isn't simply two species involved, but three or even more. The mushroom has this peculiar ability to invoke or allow or trigger a voice in the head, this logos-like phenomenon of information unrolling in your head. no other drug that I'm familiar with does that consistently. And our model of what psychedelic drugs should do has no room in it for this. Our model of what psychedelic drugs should do is derived from Freud and then secondarily from Jung. From Freud, we derive the idea that the psychedelic drug should introduce you to neurotic thought processes, repressed memory, traumatic experience, guilt laden incidents that have been forgotten, this sort of thing. From Jung, we inherit the idea that beyond that, there is a landscape of myth, and that we will encounter the great mythological motifs of the collectivity of the human psyche. But what psilocybin seems to be saying is that yes, these two areas do exist, but beyond them and far larger than them, if we can speak of such dimensions in terms of relative size, there is an area which has very little to do with humanness, collective or particular. It is simply like a landscape. It is a world in the mind, but not related to our neuroses or our religious, totemic, and mythological figures. It is, in fact, highly independent of the human ego, but nevertheless discoverable through these drugs. And in those dimensions, we come up against things like the voice of the mushroom claiming to represent a galactic form of organism, or what are conventionally called angels or demons or jinns or afrits. In other words, these traditional but rarely encountered by modern people autonomous forms of psychic existence. And we have no models for those things. For our civilization, the other, if it exists, can only come from the stars, in ships. It must be a carbon-based life form with the political and social and intellectual aspirations similar to ourselves. Science is not yet ready to entertain the idea that all points in our universe may be cotangent, that every form of intelligence in the cosmos may have the potential to communicate with every other in the here and now. Simply because to do this, science would throw open a floodgate of information that it cannot deal with. The repression of magic has been a very important part of science's program for explaining the world. Not because science has anything an intrinsic antagonism to magic, but simply because magic, if tolerated, would unleash more information than any scientific theory can cope with. Scientific theories must first limit the amount of information that they're dealing with before they can begin to model things. So in answer to your question about the mushroom and its role in human history, I've gone through many changes about this since the mushroom began talking to me, since I wrote that foreword. I have a manuscript now, which one of the titles that we toy with for it is Alien Intelligence and Psilocybin, although it probably won't be called that. A lot of what it deals with is the fact that postmodern people, which is you and me, are getting in touch with something which the modern worldview cannot handle at all. For modernity, voices in the head are a clear instance of pathology, and yet for the Hellenistic world and the postmodern world, voices in the head are a clear aspect of following the path. And this was classic before the rise of the forms of reductionist thought that characterize modern thinking. Socrates had a demon. He mentions it many times. It told him what to say. it helped him with what he should think. And it was a commonplace for sages and philosophers of that time to make that kind of claim. Psilocybin places it within the reach of modern people, but it also, by so doing, serves to demonstrate that the old models of psyche, Freudian and Jungian, just won't serve. I don't think that these things can be reconciled very easily. I think science, if it's going to take up the Enochian tables and that sort of thing, is going to transform itself to the point where it will no longer be science. Paul Feyerabend, who lives in Berkeley, I don't know if he still teaches, has written a couple of books, one called Against Method and another one called Science in a Free Society. And he makes the point there that science has really become an enemy of the free society simply by virtue of the fact that it wishes to arbitrate all models, so that somebody says, well, I believe the universe is such and so, and everyone says, well, go ask the scientists if it's true or not. This is a staggering amount of power for any group of people to have, especially a group of people whose accomplishments, and I'm not now talking about the technicians and the engineers, but the scientists, what they have accomplished is only to give us an unrecognizably abstract model of the world. So I would prefer a world of intellectual pluralism, where astrology and astronomy and Kabbalah and information theory and all these things worked in their own area, but no one claimed preeminence, because you see, this claiming of preeminence rests on a false assumption. No idea can be dismissed that is internally consistent. There's nothing more than that. Science is not more than internally self-consistent, and astrology is not less than internally self-consistent. So why should these things be placed on two different levels in terms of being arbiters of the truth? So I think that there will be, by psychology, for instance, fringe human abilities and things like that discovered. But I think higher magic will always operate according to the laws of higher magic, and that this will be a closed book to science simply because of the nature of the premises of both concerns. One of the things I didn't get to say about this time theory that I put down this evening was that it's a very anti-scientific theory. It cannot be integrated. This is not merely a physics of time that can be grafted onto orthodox physics and have science survive, because what I'm saying has certain consequences in the realm of cause and effect and experimental design that make what is normally called a scientific experience out of the question. And another untestable hypothesis that riddles science from end to end is the idea that if A causes B at time F, then A will cause B at time anything else. And that's just obviously nonsense in any realm where we experience things, but it's necessary to believe that. And so what science ends up being able to do, this is interesting, science then becomes a way of explaining anything which happens the same way over and over again, regardless of the time that it happens. We could almost describe science as the descriptive, that branch of human knowledge which is concerned with the description of those processes which are not affected by the time in which they occur. And none of those processes are interesting to living, thinking, feeling people, because everything you experience is unique, every moment, every event, every person, every situation. So what's happening here? Something is happening to the monkeys, and it's very dangerous, and it takes about 25,000 years to happen. It's a mad rush because for it to happen, the most dangerous processes in the universe have to lie present at hand. Nuclear fusion, nuclear fission, social control, genetic control. Everything has to be possible for the good to be possible. The species is completely free to mirror itself. That is, in fact, apparently what this test is about. What freedom means is you find out how good you are by discovering what you do when you have the power to destroy yourself. And we as a species are in that position, and no one can do it but us. And if we do not destroy ourselves, then very obviously the intellectual tools that we have taken in hand are the tools which will send us out to the stars. Now, as far as this idea that I talked about tonight, about temporal fractals and the nature of time and that sort of thing, that is only one aspect of this conquest of reality by information. And I think you can see, if you look back through biological and cultural history, though no one, so far as I know, has ever actually described it this way, what it really is the conquest of dimensions. With the earliest forms of life, they are like the amoeba. They essentially have a tactile perception. They can only perceive what they are immediately physically in contact with. And then in slightly higher organisms, you get the evolution of cells which distinguish light and dark. So there is at least the idea of a sense that there is something out there that comes and goes that cannot be tactilely recorded. It's the coming and going of light. But then as organisms advance in complexity, the eye is where the evolutionary thrust comes once you get past the eye spot. Then there is a sense of things at a distance, which do not tactilely impinge upon the organism, but which nevertheless have importance to the organism. They are distant pieces of food or distant enemies, and the organism learns to move toward or away from these things, and toward or away are dimensional concepts. Then, when you get truly mobile organisms, you get for instance, like monkeys or that sort of thing, they move in a much larger control space, and they move through it to grasp what they desire, and you get the evolution of a tactile sense that is under the control of the eye. And then that essentially ends with the binocular vision and the bipedal locomotion. That ends the conquest of physical dimension for biological objects. But you then get language, which seems to have something to do with time, because language allows memory and the recollection of memory, so that past states can be brought to bear on the present with an eye toward anticipation of the future. And suddenly you realize that what language is allowing this organism to do is to claim a whole new dimension. Language then is a dimension exploring vehicle of some sort. And to what degree, we don't know. Because, for instance, obviously, as animals, we contact the dimensions past and future. These are dimensions with great importance to an animal, because what you learn in the past may keep you from being eaten in the future. But then once you have the luxury of civilization, we get language applied to subjects which are neither related to the past nor the future, like mathematics. And mathematics is a language which has gone out and described multidimensional spaces. I think that nothing is more exquisite than the interior music. And all music is obviously an effort to approximate this interior music. And I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but I'm sure you all know the story of Beethoven saying, if you could hear what I can hear, you wouldn't bother with what I've written because it's just compared to what I'm hearing. You have to, it's a knife edge because the music does lead deeper into these visionary states. But I still think that once you are where you want to be, that if you can cast loose from exterior musical input, that this interior music will rise into perception and reward you for that. The way that I take psychedelic drugs seems very natural to me, but then when I describe it to groups of people like this, I realize that people have all kinds of styles, and this has caused the psychedelic experience to be sort of blurrily defined in the mass mind. My idea of how you take a psychedelic drug is that you reduce sensory input as low as you can without the reduction itself becoming an impediment. In other words, I'm not talking about isolation tanks and all that. I'm just saying a dark, quiet, calm, cool, empty room is the best kind of situation. And some of the most interesting trips that I've had have been to the accompaniment of a single sound, which is simply a drone. It's like the bindu, the seed, around which then the multiplicity of the hallucinogenic vision can gather itself and constellate. I mean, I blush to tell you this, but some of my most interesting trips have been to the accompaniment of my floor heater, which makes a buzz like a refrigerator. And that buzz becomes, the cutting edge of a light, which is like a comet giving off in the eddies of its trail hallucination, all the hallucinations there are. So I think that music is intrinsic to everything that we're talking about. We are aspiring to the condition of music, and we need music, therefore we should have it as an exterior input when we can have it no other way. So saying that that I don't listen to music during those states is not a put down of music. Music is obviously the ideal because it is one of these tonal languages that you understand by hearing. It is an Ursprach. It's a language of emotion. Now, if you're in a highly novel situation, then you get what Lilly calls cosmic coincidence, or Jung calls synchronicity. You get obvious connections which have no obvious casuistry behind them. They are connected through meaning, not through the chain of cause and effect. And that is simply happening because the level of novelty is so great that these sideways connections are beginning to come apparent. And at the end of time, or at the ingression into this higher dimension, I think this will become excruciatingly present in the foreground of our experience. In other words, synchronicity is getting stronger. Coincidence is getting stronger. The world is becoming more irrational. Science did work better in the 19th century than it's working in the 20th, because reality is slowly slipping through its fingers. There was a maximum moment when the dreams of science and the nature of reality overlaid almost perfectly, but now reality is growing beyond it and pulling away from it. And I think soon I shall be pulling away from this meeting. Thank you very much.